Truth in This Art Beyond, and we're in Philadelphia, and I'm your host, Rob Lee. Today, I am thrilled to be in conversation with my next guest, a renowned artist, educator, activist, and advocate for the arts who has recently been appointed the Dean of the School of Art at University of the Arts in Philadelphia, where she is inspiring the next generation of artists and activists. Please welcome Sheryl Oring. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm so happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. Happy you made the trek over. It's raining still, right?
Oh my gosh, it's totally raining out there. Yes.
Not quite cats and dogs, puppies and kittens. Maybe it's a little drizzle. You know.
I was wishing it would snow, but
I like that. Actually, I'm gonna pat myself on the back. Puppies and kittens. I'm gonna use that. I'm gonna use that again somewhere. I'm trying to make myself as TV dad as possible. So Reginald Vell Johnson, the whole thing. That's what I'm going for.
Awesome.
So I want to start off with sort of this vital stats, the origin story oriented question. So, if you will, could you tell us a bit about your background and please share your first creative experience with us?
So when I was thinking about my first creative experience and wondering, how far back do I go? There's sort of so many different things, but I'm going to tell you a couple stories that I think are important. One is going back to fifth grade. Well, first of all, I'm backing up a teeny bit. I grew up in Grand Forks, North Dakota. That is an hour south of the Canadian border, an hour north of Fargo. You probably know that movie.
Yes.
So I grew up an hour north of Fargo. It is a very cold place. And when I was in fifth grade, I had the really great fortune to get to go to Ithaca, New York for a year. My parents went there for a year, and it was 1975. I'm going to age myself here, but 1975, Ithaca, New York, you can probably imagine it was a little different than North Dakota. There were lots of hippies wandering around, and it was just like a totally different world. And my fifth grade teacher, her name was Nancy Cohen, she invited a poet into the classroom.
Yeah.
So we had Polly the poet who came into the classroom. I kid you not, Polly the poet. And she wore purple. So Polly the poet who wore purple. She always wore these, kind of flowing purple dresses. And she had us write poetry. And that was just a key moment for me.
Wow.
And what we did with those poems was we made books.
Really?
Yeah. So really like zines, little zines with our poems. And that was something that really stuck with me really my entire life.
Wow.
The power of poetry and the power of words and creativity and the fact that you could make your own book. I mean, all those things were just really important for me. Fast forward a little bit, I had to go back to North Dakota. Very upset about that, after a year in Ithaca. Went to middle school and this is a strange thing that I only know in retrospect. At the time, it didn't really make a big impression on me. But my seventh grade typing teacher, we took typing classes then on IBM Selectric, was also the art teacher. And the funny thing at that time was, I really couldn't draw. I had very, very little natural talent when it came to drawing, but I could type really well. I was a really good typist. And somehow, all these years later, that's become a very important fact in my biography. So yeah. Those are a couple things.
No, thank you. That's great. That is great. So having this background as an artist, the renowned artist, like that's what I read, it's out there. And there's an activist, there's an advocate lens there. Could you tell us, at what point within your creative journey that you wanted to start incorporating or felt inclined to incorporate activism into your work and how that interest has evolved over time?
Yes, absolutely. And maybe I'll talk to you a little bit first about my first career, which was in journalism.
Please.
So I studied journalism in college and did the thing, got jobs in newspapers, ended up in San Francisco. And ended up in a place at the San Francisco Chronicle where I was in meetings where people talked about what was on the front page of the newspaper. And I was often the only woman in these meetings and often the only one bringing up the fact that there were no women or people of color on the front page of the newspaper. It just, it was a really big deal at the time. Of course, now we talk about it all the time. But back then it was really not something that everybody was talking about. And it became a mission for me as an editor to really lift up stories about women and people of color within the news. It was a really a big deal. And when I went to Berlin on a journalism fellowship, and at the time I thought I was going to write. But as I got deeper into trying to learn German, it became stranger and stranger to be writing in English. And there was this thing that happened through this process of learning a foreign language, where one language was kind of being shut off because I was really trying to learn German, where I started to think more visually. Yeah. And that was really the transition that helped me move into the field of art, and something that I haven't really talked about that much or written about or anything, but it definitely happened. There was just sort of this change in my brain happening as I dove into this foreign language, and the feeling sometimes that you can't express yourself when you're trying to say something in a foreign language can be really frustrating. And somehow that pushed my brain to be thinking more visually and functioning more like a visual artist functions, I think. And yeah,
that's interesting. I've been really thinking, and it's funny how like that's unlocked through trying to learn a new language and learning like, what does this mean here? Like, how can I relate this to like sort of your vocabulary in English? And it's like, how does that relate? And I start thinking more and more about like what words mean, and kind of like this is going to sound so ridiculous, but maybe not, but over like the last maybe 20, 25 years, like how words and what their meaning has shifted and how we use them. And I think in part it's with that sort of growth of like social media, you got to encapsulate a thought in so many characters, and then sort of the definitions and the meaning of things and the meaning of sentences and how we even converse outside of that sphere has changed considerably. And I think a quarter of a century is not a short amount of time.
That's right.
So I think there's something there. And I think sort of when you're learning maybe another language, like if someone dives in and it's like, hey, I'm going to learn like Japanese for sake of argument, it's so much more meaning and complexity there than how we talk here in whatever this version of English is. And I think it's so much online stuff that kind of hinders what the language means and the sort of power of the language.
Yeah, there's so much around language, right? And I think I've thought a lot lately also about how when you learn another language, I think you also learn to take more time with understanding people who maybe don't speak the same language. Or I thought about it a lot moving to this new job, actually. I'm sort of jumping all around. But, when you move to a new place, it's almost like you don't speak the language, right? You're moving to a different culture, a different way of thinking, different history. And I was thinking how that connected to the experience of learning a foreign language, how you have to have patience, understanding, compassion, and empathy in your interactions with other people, because you don't have that shared history or that shared vocabulary. Yes,
and I think there's something that unlocks this idea of always being a novice, never a master, and I think that's what it opens us up to maybe learning something and receiving something in a different way. I'll share this. I was in New Orleans. And I'd been there a few times before, and I love it. And I love that city and it's all of the cool stuff. And I'll say, in doing this podcast, I went down there most recently and had a completely different experience and loved it in a completely different way, because I came down there as sort of this podcaster, journalist guy. And I'm like, oh, this is a story. Let's cover this. This is the angle I want to take. Let's cover this. And I was able to connect with people in a much different way. And that was the thing that was missing maybe from the previous times I was there. It's kind of not a tourist, because I'm always looking for the cracks and crevices, but it felt like that experience. It was nothing that really stayed. It was like romanticizing the city, but not really connecting it with anyone. Whereas this last time, connecting with some folks, coming down there as this guy, already having that background as a podcaster, but coming down with experience with doing interviews with folks in a concentrated period of time.
Oh, thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about, if you will, what is your first love creatively? And I know journalism is in there. I know there's art in there. So talk about your first love creatively and a bit about the process. Like, what is something that, let's say, if you're working on a book for sake of argument, what's something in the middle? What's something at the beginning? What's something at the end? Like, talk about that process.
Oh, process is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, so I was really happy to see that question. And when I had a really amazing opportunity to take a week off between jobs and went to, really off, which is very rare. And I didn't even take my computer with me. And I went to New Mexico to some hot springs.
Nice.
And yeah, it was pretty amazing, I have to say. And while I was there, I also was able to spend a little time just wandering, which is a really important thing. Mm-hmm. And wandered into a bookstore and found this book. The book is called Creativity, the Psychology and Discovery. Creativity, the Psychology of Discovery and Invention. It's by Mihaly, and I am going to slaughter the person's last name. It's something like Csikszentmihalyi. It's by a psychologist. And he talks about the 5 stages of creativity: preparation, incubation, insight, evaluation, and elaboration. And of course, this is not a linear process. This one.
I have the same one in my...
You do?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh my gosh. It's amazing, right?
Yes, it is.
What I found so just powerful in the book was that it described me. It described so much of what I do and how I function in the world. And sometimes I think as creative people, I feel misunderstood anyway. If I'm not with my people, mm-hmm. other creative people, sometimes it feels like people don't get me or people don't understand me. But he talked about these stages and how there's no linear path. You may be in one phase for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I feel now like I'm in sort of in preparation, incubation for another big project, because we'll get into more of the specific projects that I've done, but I've done 2 really large projects that have taken decades to make. Writer's Block is one, and I Wish to Stay is another. And working for decades on projects that deal with free speech and First Amendment rights and freedom of expression, et cetera, and politics, has been a huge part of my life.
Right. And
I somehow feel I'm on the verge of something new, but it's going to take a little bit of time to come out.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Wow. That's, I think that almost naturally leads us into the next question. Mm-hmm. Tell us about Writer's Block and I Wish to Say.
Okay. So Writer's Block, I think I mentioned that I went to Berlin. I went as a journalist. I had a fellowship that was supposed to be 2 months, and I took a 6-month leave from my job in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And then I did, this really crazy thing. I called and quit my job. I didn't even go back. I just stayed in Berlin.
I love that.
Yeah, that was a pretty bold act, and it was changed the trajectory of the rest of my life. So I'm really glad I made that call. And I was fixated by a couple things. One of the things was on my very first visit to Berlin, I stumbled across this place called Babelplatz. Mm-hmm. Babelplatz is the site of the Nazi book burning. So it's the place where students took books out of the library and burned them in 1933.
Wow.
Yeah, and in the middle of the square, it's a massive square in the middle of East Berlin. There's this piece by, I'm going to forget his name now, so please cut this out. And anyway, in the middle of the square, there's this work of art that is a glass window that looks down onto a room of empty bookshelves. Mm. And so it's an empty library, right? Very symbolic of what had happened on this place. And that became a place that I went to over and over again at first. When I first went to Berlin, it was just really powerful for me to think about what had happened. I started researching the book burnings, trying to understand it. Of course, it's incomprehensible, right? You can't really imagine how students would take the books out of the library and burn them. It's just crazy to think about. And then at the same time, I also started seeing, Misha Ullman is the artist who made that work. I had a little brain, something for a second. So, yeah. So I started seeing typewriters everywhere. Like everywhere I went, I saw typewriters, and I would buy one, and then I bought another one. I just thought they were really beautiful. And of course, I thought I would write poetry on them or something like that. But I kept seeing more and more. And then I just had this question in my mind: what would I do if I had a lot of typewriters? What would I make, And then I had this, and the idea for Writer's Block evolved from that question and that place that I was, the geographic location, the history of Berlin. And the word Writer's Block came to mind, and then I pieced together this whole crazy idea to make these sculptures that would be made out of old typewriters caged in this rusty construction rebar, and they would be put on the site of the Nazi book burning. make the statement about censorship. And it was meant to really also as a tribute to the writers whose books had been burned.
Yeah.
That was a whole crazy, crazy project. And I barely spoke German at the time. It was really audacious for me as this young American woman to go to Germany and say, I want to do this. And I had no money. I had nothing. I didn't have a car. But I had a lot of just determination, really raw determination that I was going to do this, and started networking and finding support. And I found a public relations agency that gave me space in their office and also kind of took me on as a project. They helped me make my first website and helped me write some things in German to, collect typewriters. And then people started helping. People started literally coming to help me. I needed help collecting the typewriters. The funniest thing from that whole time was that Daimler Chrysler gave me a car. They gave me an A-Class Mercedes for 2 months because I didn't have a way to go around and, collect the typewriters. So I had this Mercedes and I had, no money. It was just a very funny time, funny confluence of events. But, and I collected all these typewriters. And at the same time, I had to get a permit to be able to do this on this public square, right? I couldn't just go set the typewriters out there. And so I'd been very polite and sort of, done everything right. And I had written to the city and didn't get an answer. And finally, someone suggested I should just go to this planning department office. And so I kind of, knocked on the door. And the person there was this East German man. And he told me, he's like, this is off the record, but I'm going to tell you it's not going to be permitted because we're just too scared that it's going to incite some sort of violence. And so I didn't know what to do because I had been telling everybody I was going to make this work, and people had given me their typewriters. Individual people had given me their typewriters,
right.
Thinking that I was going to make this work. And, what I did was I told one of my friends who was a journalist that the city wasn't going to allow me to do it. And that was pretty amazing because the newspaper in Berlin wrote a story saying the city was banning this work.
Wow.
And then the next day, the city decided that they would let me do it. But I was originally planning to do it for 10 days, and they decided that I could only do it for 1 day, literally 24 hours. So it was this massive amount of work, insane. I was just not sleeping, not eating, working night and day to get this thing done with huge teams of volunteers. And probably the one thing I regret in my artistic practice is that I actually went by their thing. So we did, we set it up. It was there for 24 hours, and I did take it down. I should have just left it there,
It's very, very punk rock. It's like, I leave jobs and I leave up art. I'm out of here.
I really should have done that. But a lot of things happened from that. It was really the most amazing event. It was. Okay, so in researching the book burning, what had happened was on the night of the book burning, it was actually raining. And this is in 1933. Yeah. And right around the time that the Nazis were trying to light this fire with these books, the opera let out. It's next to the Opera House. And all these fancy people in their opera outfits were out on the square, and there were vendors selling chocolate and hot dogs and things like that. And people were eating in their fancy dress and watching the Nazis try to burn the books. And it was raining, so it was really hard to get the fire started.
Right.
So the night that my piece had its opening, and I worked with a couple of other amazing artists, Summer Ulrichsen, who's a choreographer, and Ari Benjamin Myers, who's a composer. They did music and dance that referenced the music and dance forms that had been banned in the Nazi period. And as they started performing, it started raining. And people didn't leave. They took out their umbrellas and stayed. So it was just this really lovely, powerful moment that happened, once and is gone. That is also a theme in my work, the ephemeral and how the power of things that happen, in a moment in time and then disappear.
I like that. On occasion, I think of sort of these moments where people talk about back in the day, you go to a concert. You got that one thing. You didn't get it recorded. You didn't get it filmed. So when you experienced it there and at one time, you were there. This was the moment. You enjoyed it. And you have those memories that are attached with it. So something that's a very short term, it wasn't your choice, but very short term sort of art installation. It is definitely just something that's going to stick with the folks that were there to experience it. It's like you can see pictures, and I saw a few pictures of Writer's Block online, and I was like, what are we It's like, oh, I get this. That was literally what it was, because I have been in more and more conversations as folks will ask me, Rob, you know art? I was like, do I? It's like, you talk to art people. Tell me about art. I was like, what is this question? But when I was looking at like your work, the images from your work, I was like, I get art. That was literally what popped up. I was like, I get this.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
That's great.
So I want to move into, let's talk about I Wish to Say a little bit.
Sure.
Because that's also a large scale. So, I mean, we're really trying to condense, as you said, a few decades of work into this chunk. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so it connects to writer's block in some way, and somehow they're really deeply connected, and maybe we'll even get into the psychology behind it too. But
Please.
So writer's block happened in Berlin. It went on tour, and one of the places I wanted to show it was in New York at Bryant Park, right behind the New York Public Library. And so it was there, which was amazing. And then it went into storage, and I was, trying to figure out what to do next. And I was in Brooklyn, living in Brooklyn. I didn't have a studio space. By then, I had moved from Berlin back to the U.S. and didn't have a lot of space, no money. I had some typewriters.
Rich in typewriters.
Rich in typewriters. And there was an organization that does First Amendment rights things in the Bay Area, and they heard about writer's block, and they wanted me to come talk to them about what it would take to show writer's block, right? These big, massive sculptures that were at that point housed on the East Coast. And they said, since you're coming, these were lawyers, actually. It was a legal organization and called the First Amendment Project. They support First Amendment rights for journalists and do legal work around that. So not an arts organization, but they said, come out, and if you have any other ideas, for what you could do while you're here, for a low budget and not too much investment, let us know. And I had started thinking about the idea of the person on the street interview and how powerful that is, as a journalist's tool. And this was 2003. We were going through I have to go back in time. George Bush was getting reelected, and I felt very disconnected from American politics. That was really the other big factor in me coming up with this idea. I'd been in Germany for 6 years. Yeah. Was like, what do people think? Like, what are people thinking? And I'm not seeing what regular people think in the news. It's just not making it to the newspaper, right?
Right.
And so it was really a confluence of my experience as a journalist and then also my experience as an artist coming together and wanting to do this thing. Oh, and the other thing, and I can't forget to say it. So my grandmother was a secretary, and she was actually a secretary at the political science department at University of Maryland.
Wow.
Yeah, for many years. And she always let me play dress up, when I went to her house. And she was a woman who always wore wigs. She always had, matching purse and shoes and all the costume jewelry. In her closet, her drawers were just filled with costume jewelry. And I remember when I was 13, I got to go visit her for about a month. And, I just got to play dress up in her closet. It was the most amazing thing. So all of these things came together with the idea that I had, which was to take a typewriter, set up a little office on a street corner, and ask people to dictate a postcard to the president. So I mentioned that idea to these people in San Francisco, and they loved it. And they said, okay, we'll work on places. And they ended up coming up with one place in Oakland and one place in San Francisco. And I had my secretary's suit on and my typewriter and my rubber stamps, and asked people if they wanted to send a postcard to the next president, and typed up the postcards. And the thing was, I didn't expect the response. I didn't know what to expect, right? You start a project, you have no idea. And this is kind of a way that I often find that I work, is like start something very small and test it, almost like an experiment. Yeah. So these were little experimental performances in a cafe in San Francisco, in an art space in Oakland. And people lined up to do this. They waited in line patiently. And it was really emotional. Like, the emotion that came out from these shows was something that I hadn't expected. Yeah. In Oakland, I remember to this day a student writing about how they didn't have school supplies. And you're like, okay, I'm writing this. This is real. The president needs to know this. There was like an urgency of wanting to share these stories. Yeah. And I decided after doing those two shows that I was going to keep doing it through the election cycle that year. That was in February 2004. And so I didn't have any, no money, no grant support, just kind of did it myself and found people to help and took the $25 bus from New York to Boston and wherever I could. And then the other thing was I had a friend who was a writer. This is the other thing, and I always like to tell students too, when you're starting out with these types of projects, you have to be really creative in how you do them. So I had this friend who was a writer, and she didn't like to drive, but she had a book tour. She'd organize a book tour, and she was like, "Would you come drive me around to my book tour, and you can do your project along the way?" So that was actually literally how I did a lot of the work in 2004.
Wow. Yeah. 2004. We're 2020.
Oh my gosh,
wow.
It's going to be 20 years. So this is huge for me. It's going to be 20 years in 2024. So I'm starting to think about that. Mm-hmm. And I'm really thinking about how I want to set this project free in the sense that I want to make it available for teachers to use in their classrooms. Yeah. I've seen how powerful it is with students, with high school students, even down to middle school, definitely college students. So I'm thinking about ways that I could make a kit and offer it for checkout or put the instructions up, online so people can do it. So that this doesn't need to be my work anymore. I've done it for 20 years. It's been amazing. The things that people have said have broken my heart and inspired me and kept me going and really been a huge part of my life.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And I got a next question about that. You may have already asked. You may have already presented the question, so I'm going to ask it in a moment. But I definitely want to comment on that, where sort of that timing, right? I was in high school, I think I was asked, in this sort of everyman thing, by I think the local news affiliate, and it was from, I think it was like an education reporter. Mm-hmm. And I just remember I was so shy on camera, and I was like, man, I don't know what I'm looking down, right? I don't know what we're going to do, but whoever we got here for the next 4 years, hopefully we know it's politics. And that's me as let's see, what, I may have been 15, may have been 16 or something. And really just being cognizant of what it means, because just listening to folks and not being able to vote at the time because I was underage, but having an awareness of this matters, guys. And it was funny because this was after a social studies course and we were talking about it. And then sort of 4 years later, I think I was 19 at this time, and I'm in college. And it's like I was burnt out. It's like, I've seen it, man. We've gone through 4 years of this, man. And it's sort of this period of re-election. And I believe that was what Bush carried, all of that stuff. And I was like, what is happening? What are we doing? And I was just kind of a different person, but still different person that I've seen things, in that 4 years. And just having a similar perspective, but a more informed perspective, and being able to go through that process of voting for the first time, and I guess seeing democracy or seeing the whole voting system, and really as an analyst and as a person that likes to ask questions, really asking a lot of questions at this point, because I'd had the experience of going through the process and being, I guess, an adult at that time in that sort of second round.
I've seen the impact that this type of active listening can have on young people. Mm-hmm. And it can be incredibly empowering, just to feel that they matter. They're, kids that I've worked with through this project that no adult has ever listened to them.
Yeah.
And just that act is somehow very powerful. And why I'd like to set this up to give to the world and as a framework, as a project that anybody can do, really. Yeah.
Because I think, it gets us in this sort of point where, there's so many different people who don't have the opportunity to have their voices heard.
Right.
And so, if you will, speak more on sort of the through line, sort of the thinking that goes into, this intersection of activism, this intersection of art. Speak more on the thinking, the psychology behind it.
I'm like, how deep do you want to go?
As deep as you would like. I mean, I don't want to drown, but
yeah. Well, I've been. Your questions are so provocative in a good way. I really appreciated your questions. I appreciate your questions, and I think you're going to get me to talk about something I've never talked about.
Please.
So, why did I make this work? Writer's block, and I wish to say, right? I mean, there's a deep personal connection to the work. They're really self-portraits. So, I grew up in a family with a severely mentally ill sibling, and it was never really diagnosed. So it's hard. I've always had a hard time talking about it because it's like, what do I say? I mean, but the end result was that, I felt like I was the one who was sort of saying, like, there's a problem here, right? Like, but nobody was listening. It was like, it was very hard for my parents to come to terms with what was going on, or even like acknowledge what was going on. And so I think the work is really a reflection of that experience, right? First being like feeling like I couldn't express myself, and next feeling like nobody was listening. And so I really empathize with people who have that feeling of being oppressed or not being heard or not being empowered, right? Like that was from a really personal family situation. And I think I'll stop here, but you feel free to ask follow-up questions to all that.
No, thank you. And I think I get where you're going, and to the degree in which you presented, and I relate in that, being told that, hey, you have this perspective or this interest, this doesn't matter, it's not that important, or being told to make yourself smaller, for whatever reason, don't make waves. And by virtue of being who I am, it's like I can't help some of that stuff, right? And it comes up every now and again. And I had this conversation with someone recently in doing this, and with doing so many interviews and talking on here more than I would like. I'm a very shy individual, right? And, having this feeling of, as much as I try to support folks sharing their story, I also feel voiceless while at the same time. And it's like trying to have sort of this perspective and helping other folks get their perspective out there.
Well, journalism, that's what we do, right? You get other people to tell their stories. And so I think that's partly why it's been hard for me and why I haven't really connected the deeply personal side of this work to the work. It's remained as, the political, and which it is, of course. It's highly political, and activist and all that. But it did come from this really personal place. Yeah. And this connects to what I do in academia as well.
Please,
so just fast forward in time, and not to be a big downer, but my brother did eventually commit suicide. And so it's something that I'm highly attuned to, and it's like it follows me wherever I go. So that happened about 12 years ago now, but that when in my first teaching job, there was a faculty member who committed suicide at my university, and it was kind of covered up. Like, nobody wanted to talk about it. It was like just happened, but wasn't out there. Then a student committed suicide. Then another student committed suicide. It wasn't until the third student committed suicide, and that was after I had left that university, but I was still friends with some of the people there. It wasn't until after the third instance of suicide in one department that people talked about it openly.
And I think it's interesting. Like, one of the things I try to insert, to try to work a little bit of my sensibilities into like the back end, like when I brought in the rapid fire questions, which some people call like the BS questions, I'm like, look, I don't want the guest to feel like a commodity. Just tell me about your work. Why are you interested? Why should people care? It's like, no, tell me about who you are as well in there. And one of the things I've recently been adding in there, because, old Dad Rob is here, it's that sort of self-care component. I start asking people, did you have breakfast today? Yes or no, or how many hours of sleep are you getting? Some of those things that, if you aren't paying attention to, some of the unhealthy or unproductive and just scary things can present themselves. And, you're not thinking like straight, not to macroly speak on anything, but it's always worth checking in on someone, especially creative folks, especially folks that are working a lot very sensitive.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So in shifting just a touch, you were touching on academia a bit. So talk about what you're doing in your current role.
Mm-hmm. So I just started as Dean of the School of Art at University of the Arts here in Philly, which I'm so excited about. It's really great to be here. And there's a lot to do. This is a challenging time for students. It's a challenging time for everybody. I think that we haven't recovered from the pandemic by any means. And yet there's sort of a feeling maybe overall in society that we should just get on with life. But we can't. People lost 2 years. There was this, and not just 2 years. I mean, what I find in moving locations is that there's this period of time where people experience such loss and such different loss, and it was in really personal ways that are different from you to me, depending on your personal circumstances. Do you have kids at home? Do you have elderly parents? Did you lose your job? Did you, there's so many different factors that made the experience of the last 2 years very different from person to person. And so you can't make assumptions at all what somebody went through. And yet we're expected to sort of come back and just, be some kind of normal. No, it doesn't work like that. So, and for students, they lost 2 years and now they're at the university and they can't get that time back.
It's 2 years, but then I think we always feel like we lose a year somewhere in the middle, because as I'm looking at it, it's like, it'll be March soon. And, day job is in higher ed. And I was like, we left in March. Yeah. I was like, this is coming up on an anniversary, right? And then you almost think of sort of the buffer time around that. Like, we were just coming back or preparing for spring break. And then on the back end of it, things aren't going to be back to normal as far as the, faculty that's there, what graduation looked like, all of these different things that we present as hallmarks and things that you have to accomplish because we look at education in a certain way here, even though we really, really don't.
Well, what you just said, it's been 3 years. I said 2 years, but, it's been 3 years. 3 years. And because this year wasn't any form of normal either. So we have 3 years of adjusting, and I think so. Mental health is really high on my list of priorities for students and faculty and staff and everyone that I work with at UArts. I think for students, it's particularly challenging. The way that we come together changed so fundamentally, and so we find students being uncomfortable with too much time together. Right? Like, it's basic things, really basic things. Like, we're just starting to get back to in-person events, like bigger events, right? And gatherings and kind of socializing. And the way we socialize is different. And our capacity to socialize is different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like, I feel it. Everybody I talk to feels it. We're not able anymore to maybe function at the high level of interaction that we did prior to the pandemic. I think for artists, this is maybe a particular change. Like, a lot of artists need time alone, right? And in the pandemic, we had this extreme amount of time alone. But now we're coming back. You need both. This is rambling, but I feel like this is a good place to read that. Back to that creativity book.
Please.
There was a quote that really struck me. It said, "Make sure that where you work and live reflects your needs and tastes. There should be room for immersion and concentrated activity and for stimulating novelty." That's really important, right? "The objects around you should help you become who you intend to be, what you intend to be. Think about how you use your time and consider whether your schedule reflects the rhythms that work best for you. If in doubt, experiment until you discover the best timing for work and rest, for thought and action, for being alone, and for being with people." And that to me is so right on, right? And what I think is powerful about where we are right now in time is that we have more choice about how we structure our days than we did prior to the pandemic. We can work from home in many places, not everywhere, of course, but in some jobs that we do, we can take our work home and structure our days differently. Yeah. I just remember being in academia 10 years ago, and there was zero flexibility for some of the jobs. They wanted people in the office every day, not for the professors, but for some of the staff people. And I think it's actually not necessary.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I encounter, I try to, from my vantage point, I try to just work in like, hey, almost like a consigliere, almost like a little finger if you're a Game of Thrones sort of person. It's like, yeah, you ever think about this 4-day work week? Maybe we should trim this down, or can we look at this configuration and, just in a different way? And I was like, one could say that there's a business case for this.
Oh, yeah.
And I, try to present it in that way to make it feel like, because, people love hearing themselves talk, make it feel like it's their idea, but really take a temperature read. People are finding ways not to be in the office, and this setup doesn't work, in many regards. So if the case is for students who've graduated under those terms, or, classes who've graduated under those terms, who've had the virtual graduations and commencement and all of that. So if we're saying that graduation, that whole experience is of the same value, then why are we treating the work differently? Like you have to be in here, or this work isn't really work. You're only operating at this percentage or what have you. I think it's been proven through, small sample sizes, especially in Europe, that a 4-day work week, people are a little bit more productive because you don't really worry about the hump day. You're kind of just doing your stuff. And I think a shift to the work being task-oriented versus, hey, you have to be in here 40 hours or whatever it looks like, being here to get your stuff done. That's really what it is, I think.
Yeah. But going back to your question about, what's happening at UArts, so mental health is huge. I also want to talk about, the priorities that drove my art practice, which were giving voice to the voiceless, really. That's also a huge priority in academia, right? Looking at which artists are we teaching in our classes? Which artists are we showing? Is there a great representation of BIPOC artists, queer artists, women artists, people who haven't necessarily gotten the respect and the respect that they deserve in the classroom? I just the other day, there was these stories in the press about the Tate reorganizing their permanent collection, and they were going to do 50% women or something like that. Mm-hmm. And, I was telling my daughter, she's a mixed race child, and she's like, is it going to be 50% BIPOC or, women of color? How are they going to do that mix, Mom? And I'm like, that is such a great question. And the news was all just 50% women. Mm-hmm. It's like they hadn't even thought about who exactly. But yeah, these are things that young people are asking for and demanding, and definitely we in positions of power within academia need to respond to and make change that is really long overdue.
Yeah, and it kind of leaves out that conversation around intersectionality and all of that. It's like it's not the same, but I think sort of the conversation is similar when there was this sort of belief. My partner's also in higher ed, mm-hmm. and when there was a lot of rumblings, I want to say in 2020, after George Floyd was murdered and all of the fallout and all of the demonstrations and all and activism around that. I remember, politically speaking, there was a lot of shawls, a lot of kneeling, a lot of kente cloth, and I was like, And there was some thinking that, we might get reparations, and I went immediately back to my experience in college. That's all we talked about, and at a point I was like, how are they going to determine who's black? Because we're here now, and they get real weird of who's black at certain points or what have you. So if they're going to say, we're doing this in this way, how did they make that sort of determination? It's not going to be something that we're all going to be happy about. It's going to be something that feels super racist and weird. And I think that was sort of the mic drop around mm-hmm. that, because it's never been a good way. I was like, they can determine. I was like, they can determine a lot of things, but they won't. And this sort of notion around, the things that you want to do, you're able to do. Mm-hmm. Like when we got sort of whatever check or what have you that was given out, I call it the Trump check. Whenever that came out, that information was there. It was quick. You were able to get it. but people who were in a more vulnerable position, it seemed like it was harder for them to get it.
Right.
So it's like, no, this is going to be weird. Let's not fall into it. Let's stay focused on really what we want. And really, we want justice. We want these things around this issue, not sort of this shift. It's a distraction. Don't fall for, oh, I threw a pin that way. Look that way. Keep focus on what it is. And that, I think, hits in various areas. When there's sort of this shift of, hey, we're suddenly woke now. Cool. How are you going to really do that, though? What does it look like in practice?
Right. Right. So in Detroit, one of the things that we did when the pandemic happened and we had to close our gallery, I rented a billboard space in the middle of Detroit, and we did this exhibition that we called In the Air. It was right at the same time all the Black Lives Matter protests were happening around the country. And we got artists of color to make work that related to this whole movement and put it right front and center in the middle of Detroit. It may not sound like a big deal, but it kind of was. It really changed the feeling that people had in the community for the university, because the university, even though it's right in the middle of Detroit, had been run by white people for many years, right? And I think it changed the mood and sort of opened up a conversation and a way of collaborating in the future with artists in the city. It's, these things are difficult. And I think that something like that was a good first step and not an end goal. It was, and then, hopefully the people who are there can continue that conversation and keep trying to make change.
Thank you. Let's see. I want to ask you one more question as we're coming up on time, which I always have to be aware of time. It's always time here.
Yes.
So this is sort of the last question that I had before I get to those rapid fire questions, because I always have to get the rapid fire questions. So could you share your vision for inspiring this next generation of artists, or have you, through your work with University of the Arts, UArts? Could you share your thoughts in that area, and we can close on that piece there?
Yeah, well, I want to create an atmosphere of belonging and respect and create opportunities for students. I think that's one of the most important things that students can get out of an education, to come through, be challenged, learn how to think differently, possibly bring their own experiences to the table, but also have conversations with others who might be different from them and learn from that. Travel's always been really important for me, coming up with ways for students to experience different places, whether it's in the U.S. or outside the U.S., and creating creative thinkers and people who are confident in their abilities and know that they're going to be the next generation to change the world.
It's great. It's great. I love the vision. I must say. So now it's this portion where I want to go into these rapid fire questions I have for you, and then we'll wrap on that with some shameless plugs and all of that. So for you, what is the first thing that you do in the morning?
Oh, the first thing that I do in the morning, I usually turn on some music. Depends what it is. Or the other thing, very first thing, I usually write to my daughter. She's not with me right now, so I usually text her.
Okay. I was hoping you'd say the same thing. I say dread the day.
You what? Dread the day?
Yes. It's like, my knees are, usually I'm going to the gym at like 5:30 or what have you. I'm heading to the gym.
That is early.
Yeah. Whoa. Doing this new thing. I've been lifting heavy, so it's been something.
Impressive.
Thank you. Are you more oriented toward learning by watching or learning by doing?
No, that's a hard question. I was thinking it shouldn't be a hard question. But to me, they go together. So like, I like to watch and then do.
Okay.
That's a bad answer, but
no, it's an honest answer. There's no such bad thing as bad answers. Honest answers. Salty or sweet?
Probably salty.
What is your favorite font? Now we're getting into the typography portion of the podcast.
My favorite. Well, the one that I like to use if I'm trying to do anything with typewriters is Trixie. It's a typewriter font.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll leave it with that. And if it's more designy, then maybe Helvetica.
And this is the last question I got for you. This is the pop culture question I thought you were going to enjoy. So movies with famous typewriters. Which movie do you prefer, The Shining or Misery?
The Shining.
Okay. I thought you would appreciate what I did there.
I do.
I was trying.
I do.
I was trying. So I want to thank you for being on this podcast, taking the time and chatting with me and sharing and sharing and sharing.
You're so welcome. Thanks for your excellent questions.
Thank you. And in the final moments here, I want to invite and encourage you to share anything that you want, social media, website, any of the stuff that you want to share with the listeners. The floor is yours.
Oh, thanks. My website is SherylOring.org. It's SherylOring.org. And I'm Sheryl Oring on Instagram.
And there you have it, folks. I want to again thank Sheryl Oring from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia for coming onto the podcast and sharing with us. And I'm Rob Lee, saying that there's arts and culture and activism in and around your neck of the woods. You've just got to look for it.